With Final Fantasy XV just around the corner, it's easy to look back at the game as a project 10.5 years in development. But as with most lengthy projects, there's a lot of details and forgotten facts hidden beneath that surface. So before we welcome the new member of the Final Fantasy main series, let's really take a look at how it went from Final Fantasy Versus 13 to Final Fantasy 15, starting by going all the way back to 2003. After development had wrapped up on Final Fantasy X-2 and Kingdom Hearts, Yoshinori Kitase, the lead producer of the Final Fantasy series at the time, sat down with Tetsuya Nomura and Shinji Hashimoto to discuss where to take the series next. Having started work on the compilation of Final Fantasy VII, the multimedia brand for Final Fantasy VII's expanded universe, the three discussed the idea of creating a collective theme from scratch next, rather than basing it on an established title. This birthed the idea of Fabula Nova Crystallis, the new fable of the crystal. The concept was fairly simple: come up with a vague mythos upon which several games could be based without directly sharing a narrative or universe, while giving developers the ability to use established lore before detailed writing had taken place. Since Final Fantasy XII was already well into development, it was decided that Fabula Nova Crystallis would be applied to the 13th entry in the series, and the work in creating this new mythos began. Terms like Fal'Cie, L'Cie, Sif, the god Bonivelsa and the goddess Etro were established, and in February 2004, Final Fantasy XIII was put in production. The 2004 version of Final Fantasy XIII was not the same project as the title we'd eventually see released in 2009, however, but rather a PlayStation 2 title. During early engine tests and gameplay brainstorming, the project was rebooted for PlayStation 3 following the positive reception of the Final Fantasy VII tech demo. As such, in May 2005, two games were conceptualized: Final Fantasy XIII and Final Fantasy Versus 13, the latter of which was set to start full production after the release of Kingdom Hearts 2 in 2005. Two more games, the mobile title Final Fantasy Agito 13, which later released as the PSP title Final Fantasy Type 0, and Final Fantasy Haeresis 13, which never entered production, were also put in the Fabula Nova Crystallis mix. Nomura wasted no time following Kingdom Hearts 2 and immediately reassembled the same development team to start working on Final Fantasy Versus 13. In May 2006 at E3 in Los Angeles, Square Enix formally announced Final Fantasy Versus 13 with a memorable trailer featuring pre-rendered footage of the lead character, Crown Prince Noctis, fighting Imperial soldiers while using magic to warp around the world. It was dark and moody, with the game showing a clear taste for grit and gore, setting up a very different Final Fantasy game than any before it. The tagline for the game was "a fantasy based on reality," referring to the world being based on a contemporary setting much akin to our Earth, rather than a classic fantasy setting or a futuristic sci-fi setting. Despite not giving us much info, the new take on the series, mixed with the promise of Kingdom Hearts 2's development team being in charge, made sure to hype up the fans a lot. But it didn't take long before production problems would arise. The team was bare bones and not ready to take part on a project of this size on a brand new system. Former Square Enix Visual Works employee Eiji Kitada described that a mere 2 people, himself included, was in charge of making the 3D CG work for the longest time, making for a slow and tedious process, especially since they were working on other projects including Final Fantasy VII Advent Children Complete at the time. Despite having been revealed at E3 2006, the project mostly stood still in pre-production for the next 2 years, until 2008 when Square Enix revealed the updated Crystal Tools engine and we were shown the first new footage of Versus 13. Starting off with new pre-rendered footage, we were reintroduced to Noctis and got to meet a new character, Stella, for the first time. The 2008 footage also featured a first look at the game in-engine, a cutscene featuring both Noctis and Stella having a conversation, though there weren't any voice acting yet. The music by Yoko Shimomura was enough to leave most fans excited. Unfortunately, the game would soon disappear from the public radar once more, not resurfacing for another 2 years. As of March 2010, Final Fantasy XIII had been released worldwide to a mixed fan reception, and as such, some were starting to doubt that Versus 13 would live up to its promise as well, which Nomura would soon respond to. In multiple interviews with Japanese magazines and websites, Nomura assured fans that Versus 13 featured enough classic elements for older fans to be happy and enough new elements for newer fans to be excited. Features like player-controlled airships, something not seen since Final Fantasy IX in 2000, was promised alongside Moogles, an open world, and much more. Despite not being ready to show more of the game off, the promises kept coming. Concepts like the camera being manipulated by the player in every single cutscene was promised yet never demonstrated, and visual fidelity so high that the only difference between the in-engine and pre-rendered characters would be the hair was how the game was now being sold. Until Tokyo Game Show the same year. Behind closed doors, the first gameplay of Final Fantasy Versus 13 was finally shown and later released a few months later to the public. Alongside the gameplay was the first look at the redesigned main characters. While originally having sported outfits designed by Nomura himself, the cast was now wearing designer clothes by Japanese fashion brand Roen, something promised in 2006 but not delivered upon until now. The footage, though short and mainly released to demonstrate actual progress having been made on the game, was enough to leave a lot of fans hopeful for a release. And their hopes were seemingly well founded at first, as 2011 brought us a lengthy portion of gameplay showing combat, party control, bosses and more for the very first time. While a lot had changed since the initial reveal, or even the 2010 footage, it seemed general promise of the game was intact. The blood and gore was gone, but the Kingdom Hearts style gameplay mixed with a contemporary setting was no doubt alive and well to the eyes of those who saw the footage. Final Fantasy Versus 13 was cancelled that same year. While the official details wouldn't resurface for several years, the reason for Versus 13's delay is now clear as day. The content demonstrated in 2011 was satisfying to many, but clearly not an indication that the past 5 years of development had bared fruit. Square Enix was losing money, fast, having put more money into projects than they could possibly earn back from them, an issue that the company kept up doing for years. Final Fantasy XIII had enough content on the cutting room floor that was finished to build entire sequels on, which they did, and meanwhile Versus 13 was sitting there barely getting anywhere. Expensive marketing deals, high production values and slow progress wasn't the only issues, however. Another problem was Nomura himself, who seemingly couldn't decide what he wanted the game to be. The size of the story has been said to be too large to fit in a trilogy of games, let alone a single title, and the tone and theme would shift so much that at one point Nomura wanted to turn Versus 13 into an actual musical instead of a standard cinematic game. That's not to say that Nomura's ideas were necessarily bad, but they were unfocused to the point where nothing could truly be made from them, and Joichi Wada, the CEO of Square Enix at the time, had to pull the plug on the project. Nomura would eventually start production on Kingdom Hearts 3 and Final Fantasy VII Remake, two games where he had more of a clear goal on what he wanted to achieve, but it seemed Versus 13 was at the time set to be forgotten. Until... Having just finished development of Final Fantasy Type 0, director Hajime Tabata had seen the end of Versus 13 and wasn't fond of its fate. When the studio received their first details on the upcoming PlayStation and Xbox consoles, he decided to ask Yoshi Wada permission to develop a pitch demo for a new Final Fantasy using assets from the Versus 13 project. Wada approved, and during the summer of 2012 the Type 0 team moved to action with key members of the former Versus 13 team. Using a heavily modified version of the Crystal Tools engine, referred to internally as the Ebony engine, the team created a pitch demo in 6 months that they presented to Wada, which impressed him enough to greenlight the project, putting it into full production. Knowing that questions about Versus 13 would arise at events, Square Enix decided to make the official announcement of Final Fantasy XV at E3 2013. While the change of director and larger details remained secret for the time being, 2 lengthy videos using the Ebony pitch demo was released to the public. A story trailer showing Noctis escaping Lucis, being attacked by the Imperial forces and Leviathan, and a gameplay trailer showing off the combat system against a large behemoth. Despite production going well, we would have to wait another 15 months before we got further details on Final Fantasy XV and an explanation for just what happened. At Tokyo Game Show in September 2014, a massive bomb of information was dropped for Final Fantasy XV. Hajime Tabata was revealed as the director of the title, the announcement of a public demo for people who bought Final Fantasy Type 0 HD, a new character, and the central theme of the story all came out at once. Having adapted the central theme of Versus 13's lengthy unfinished story into a single game title set around the original game's road trip style adventure, Final Fantasy XV finally made the project look like it had a clear focus for the first time since its initial reveal. However, with the new details came news of cut aspects of both Versus 13 and the E3 2013 trailer, which would not sit well with many fans going forward. It was revealed that the escape out of Lucis was no longer part of the game, since the story begins outside of Lucis instead. There was also the character of Stella, which was now replaced by Luna Freya the Oracle, mainly serving the same role but with a slight redesign and a new weapon replacing her original sword. In order to please fans and make sure that their progress on developing the game was well documented, Tabata started the Active Time Report series, where him and other key members of the Final Fantasy XV team would talk about all sorts of progress made on a semi-regular basis, opening a window directly into the dev studio for its fans. And it was this open conversation that would bring light to a lot of situations of studio intent versus fan expectations. Nomura's promise of airships and Mughals originally didn't have a place in Tabata's vision of Final Fantasy XV, but after a lot of consideration and fan feedback, they were added into the game through the flying form of Noctis' car, the Regalia, and the Mughal collection plush toys that can be used in combat to distract enemies. The latter edition was included as the result of an online poll the team held for its fans. But perhaps the biggest omission from Versus 13 is the combat system. While Versus 13 featured a Kingdom Hearts-esque control scheme including a command menu and an added option to switch out the party leader, Final Fantasy XV was revealed to only give the player control of Noctis, to focus on the revamped combat and control system unique to the new project. Rather than making a traditional action RPG that required tight button inputs, Tabata wanted a system that could be enjoyed by casual players and those who prefer turn-based combat as well, which led to a challenge for how to design the mechanics the game required. This led to the Assault and Defense mode, where the player can opt to merely holding down the attack button to let Noctis perform combos and move to enemies on his own, or hold down the defense button to dodge attacks at the cost of magic points. While the system went through several changes from its first reveal to its present iteration, such as originally featuring a so-called weapon deck that would change Noctis' held weapon with every strike of a combo, to a more standard 4-way equip menu in the game's lower left corner, the core concept remained the same. Make an action RPG that players who never touched an action RPG could easily pick up and play. Closer to release, further mechanics were implemented to satisfy players, such as the ability to play with a wait mode that turns the game's combat into a slower paced tactical approach more akin to traditional Final Fantasy games. In this mode, the player can pause time in between each input while making their decisions, not unlike how Final Fantasy XII worked. But while a lot was changed from Versus 13, much stayed the same as well. The mysterious female Dragoon revealed in the 2011 gameplay footage reappeared in 2016 as Aranea Highwind, one of the game's many antagonists, and it was recently announced that after release the team will work on making the rest of the party playable, first as separate story DLC and eventually as part of the main game through multiplayer co-op, a feature returning to the mainline Final Fantasy single-player games for the first time since Final Fantasy IX. While Final Fantasy XV is now far more than just one single game, having an expanded universe that already stretches across movies, anime series and even multiple games, Tabata and his team have said that their main dedication had been to make the story within Final Fantasy XV a single complete story. A story about heritage, sins of the past and finding your own place in the world. Tomorrow, on November 29th, we'll finally be able to witness the story ourselves, a story 13 years in the making. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you're as excited for Final Fantasy XV as I am. If you haven't checked out the other parts of my Countdown to 15 series, then please do.